Have you ever heard, or even said yourself, that Formula One was better in the old days? That the races were more exciting, that the drivers were braver and more skilled, that the cars looked better and sounded better? And on that, I have to agree, and that everything, in every aspect of this sport, was superior, better, more fun, more passionate. For many people, the 70s, 80s, and 90s were the so-called golden age of Formula One. But the thing is, according to Formula One research, 50% of people who watch races nowadays have been doing so for less than 5 years, and we can see that in our own audience as well. So, this crowd, and even some people who already used to watch but maybe don't remember or didn't see the races in those decades, might get the impression that back then there was an El Dorado, a Ratanaba, a promised land of fiercely contested races, top-level drivers, where you never knew who was going to win. And then, as is typical for this channel, that question comes up. Is that really the case? Let's take a close look, slicing up Formula One from those 70s, 80s, and 90s decades, in search of this lost ark, this holy grail, that era when everything was wonderful and made today's Formula One look like nothing. That's what we're going to talk about today on Splash and Go. Where is it? Where was it? Did this enchanted era really exist? Let's go. We're going to place this so-called golden era between the mid-70s and the mid-90s, between 75 and 95. Deal? And to do that, we'll break down our analysis into 4 topics: drivers, cars and teams, broadcasting, and the races. A lot of people complain nowadays about some drivers being below par, and some, in fact, weren't as good as the rest. Just look at, in recent years, Logan Sargent, Nicholas Latifi, maybe pushing it a bit, Lance Stroll, and going a little further back, Sergei Sirotkin, Jolyon Palmer, and others. Well, it's true. These drivers never won hearts and minds, never drew crowds, and won't be remembered 50 years from now. I have to admit that. But the fact is, and this bothers a lot of people when I say it here, that the current grid is much stronger than it used to be, and that this category of backmarkers, the so-called field fillers, is getting smaller and, right now, has almost disappeared. The Formula One of budget caps and predictable revenues, with everyone more or less knowing what they're going to earn, has eliminated the need for paid drivers. Sargent may have been the last of his kind, but a quick look at the grid, even in times when Formula One prided itself on being professional, shows that the level used to be much lower. Much lower, both in absolute and relative terms, because the grid was much larger. For example, in 1989, the year pre-qualifying was introduced, 37 entrants tried to secure a spot on the grid for the Brazilian Grand Prix in 𝘾𝙤𝙥𝙮𝙧. And among those in pre-qualifying, you would find some forgettable names in history. And I'm going to show you a few of them. 13 drivers competed in the session on Friday morning, aiming to earn a spot in qualifying. Martin Brundle, Stefano Modena, Gregor Wojtek, Nicola Larini, Bernd Schneider, Alex Caffey, Piercarlo Ghinzani, Volker Weidler, Pierre-Henri Raffinel, Joachim Winkelhock, Aguri Suzuki, Stefan Johansson, and Bertrand Gachot. Here we have some pretty questionable ones, to say the least. Brundle and Modena were, in fact, good drivers with results, but Gregor Wojtek, a Swiss, has as his most notable achievement in motorsport almost killing Johnny Herbert in a Formula 3000 race, months earlier, in '88. Larini never did anything exceptional. Bernd Schneider, yes, a driver who would later go on to win championships in touring cars. Alex Caffey might just barely pass the minimum test, but Piercarlo Ghinzani, you might never have even heard of, and you didn't miss anything because of that. Volker Weidler and Pierre-Henri Raffinel never had decent cars because they didn't deserve them. They were bad. Joachim Winkelhock, father of Markus Winkelhock, the one who led a lap at the European Grand Prix at Nürburgring in 2007. That was the race where Massa had a shouting match with Alonso, and he can't really be called a genius either. He has 2 important titles in his career, a German Formula 3 and a BTCC, the British Touring Car Championship, in 1993. Other than that, he went pretty much unnoticed in motorsport. Aguri Suzuki managed a podium in Japan in 1990. Stefano Hansson and Bertrand Gachot just barely passed the minimum test. But you noticed right away how many forgettable names there are in this story. right? Yeah, but that's not all. 30 cars made it to qualifying, and on Saturday, they would fight for 26 spots on the grid. And then the best from pre-qualifying joined those who already had results from the previous year, and went on to battle with others like 𝙤𝙤𝙙𝙧𝙞𝙤𝙀𝙧, Christian Danner, Olivier Grouillard, Luis Perez Salar, Eddie Cheever, Philippe Alliot, and a famous name, Henri Pesca. René Arnoux, who was in his last year in Formula One, and even though he had results, if you watch races from the 80s, he became known for never letting people by when he was being lapped. Oh, Damien, you just picked an isolated case. Alright, let's go back, I don't know, to 1983, the year I was born, okay? Blind test, competed or at least took part in one session, at least one free practice, tried to qualify for quali, some of these here, who are then added to the list of those who, at some point, were registered for some event in the 1983 championship. For example, Roberto Guerrero, the same Giancarlo Ginzani, De Cesaris, Kenny Hutchinson, I didn't even remember this guy, Jacques Villeneuve Sr., Gilles Brother, uncle of Jacques, who became champion in '97, Eliseo Salazar, the only Chilean driver to make it to Formula One, whose biggest moment of fame was that brawl with Piquet at Hockenheim. Remember? Anyway, you get my point. The level of the drivers was so low. The super license system was created precisely when Eccleston wanted to professionalize Formula One. The goal was to standardize. If I want to sell an event internationally, charge for broadcasting rights, and get million-dollar sponsorship deals for a circus that travels to 16 races a year. Back then, organizing successful races, it was obvious. The best cars in the hands of the best drivers. Only then would we have a selling point. And then it was no longer possible to allow people who were just wealthy, with no technical skill whatsoever, to get onto the grid and tarnish the reputation and image of that spectacle. That's when the super license mechanism was created. It was officially named this in 1990, but way back at the start of the 80s, Bernie Eccleston and FOCA, together with FISA, the sporting arm of the FIA, which is all the same thing today, were already concerned about policing and demanding this minimum standard. Otherwise, drivers like Ricardo Londono, and I talk about this guy in the video about shady sponsors, he had some strange connections with the Medellin cartel, could end up on the grid. At that time, for example, IMSA, the International Motorsport Car Association, an endurance championship for sports prototype races in the United States, had earned the nickname International Marijuana Smuggler Association. Why? Because a lot of drug traffickers who liked racing would go out and race those big cars. One of them, in fact, Randy Lanny, became famous and even had a documentary episode about him on Netflix. The concern with minimum standards then officially led to the creation of the super license in 1990, but there were already some mechanisms in place to keep certain drivers out at the beginning of the 80s. Still, there were some fast, admittedly crazy, and very wealthy guys who kept on racing. Andrea de Cesaris is probably the most notorious case among them. He had speed, managed to get a few podiums, but he only lasted so long on the grid because his father was the biggest Marlboro cigarette distributor in all of Europe. So, he never lacked money to race or Marlboro stickers plastered on his racing suit. On top of all that, the drivers weren't professional athletes, and there's a famous story about a super champion, Alain Prost, who raced in Monaco with a hangover. He told Niki Lauda, his teammate at the time, that he'd stayed up late drinking champagne with the princess. Today, to get onto the grid, there are objective requirements, and if you don't meet them, you don't get a spot. Just ask Colton Herta, the American. Without enough points for a super license, which you get through results in junior categories and international races, you can't compete. It's just like those games, like Gran Turismo, where you can only race in the faster events, with better cars and longer races, after you've won at the lower levels. But the topic of drivers is just one of 4 we're going to talk about today, because besides them, we also have the teams. The level of the teams in the mid-70s, 80s, and even up to 1995 was extremely low. Top organizations, like the ones we know, Ferrari, McLaren, Williams, were the exception. Until 1991, it wasn't even mandatory to run 2 cars. We had teams showing up, registering just 1 car and 1 driver. This, along with the generally lower technical standards, meant that teams that looked more like Formula 3 or Formula 3000 outfits would show up on the grid, running much slower. Cars that were 6, 7, even 8 seconds slower. I took a step forward and pulled up the 1984 championship here, and I'm going to talk to you about the teams that were entered. Brabham, important, with a strong technical history. Tyrrell, Williams, McLaren, Ram, which barely lasted at all, Lotus Renault, ATS Renault, the factory team itself, Arrows, Toleman, then Spirit, Alfa Romeo, Osella, Bigia, and Ferrari. About 4 teams on that grid were borderline amateur. Osella, with the already mentioned Piercarlo Ghinzani and the Austrian Joe Gartner. Spirit, with Rube Rothengatter, a Dutchman who, in fact, was one of Max Verstappen's first managers early on. ATS, with Manfred Winkelhock, who happens to be Joachim Winkelhock's brother and Marcus Winkelhock's uncle. And RAM, with Philippe Alliot, Jonathan Palmer, and Mike Sackwell. In 1991, the year Ayrton Senna won his 3rd championship and 7 years ahead on the timeline, with a lot having happened and Formula 1 already growing bigger and bigger, and here in Brazil possibly experiencing its peak of popularity, we had teams on the grid like Lambo, which was actually called Modena, but everyone knew there was a hidden involvement from Lamborghini behind it. And in the car, Eric van der Poel, a Belgian, and Nicola Larini, or Coloni, with the Portuguese driver Pedro Chavez, whom you probably didn't know, and I don't blame you, and the Japanese driver Naoki Hattori, who did the last 2 races of the year because he brought money. GS had Gabriel Tarquini, Olivier Grouillard, Fabrizio Barbesa, and Stefan Hansson throughout the year. 4 drivers, 2 cars. You can tell there were some changes in the middle of the season. And Lotus itself, going downhill, in decline, also had 4 drivers in 2 cars. Mika Häkkinen, a young McLaren driver, did the whole season. Johnny Herbert took over halfway through because Julian Bailey ran out of money, and needing a bit more cash, they also made room for the German Michael Bartels. This party of teams running with just 1 car would end in '92. But, in '96, the level of the 9-to-5 teams had been so low, especially the cars from 40 Course, Simtech, and Pacific, that the FIA approved, with lobbying from the front-running teams, the 107% rule, and established. No one qualifies for the grid if they're outside 107% of the pole position time. To make it easy, imagine a lap of 100 seconds, that's 1 minute and 40 seconds, so 60 plus 40. You only make it onto the grid if you do it in under 1 minute and 47 seconds. 7 seconds, almost 8 behind the leader, that's a huge gap. Nowadays, for example, it's normal to see the whole grid, 20 cars, within 1 second. Sometimes, even less. This lower level among the teams happened because it was a normal process, similar to soccer, where a team winning in the lower division would move up to a higher one, like going from A2 to A1 in soccer. Jordan was an example of that. They won the Formula 3000 championship in 1989, spent 1990 getting ready, and entered Formula 1 in 1991. 40 Course, with Pedro Paulo Diniz and Roberto Moreno in '95, had taken exactly the same path. And DAMS itself, which still races in Formula 2 and Formula 3 today, almost bought La Russ's assets back in 1996 to do the same thing, to move up, to rise to the top division, to the Premier category. Nowadays, that's practically unimaginable. After all, the technical scale, the level of development, the size of the operation, the number of people involved in a Formula 1 team, close to 1,000 people, with some teams having almost 2,000, can't even be compared to the demands of lower categories like Formula 2 and Formula 3. Even successful cases like Stewart, which with Rubens Barrichello and Jan Magnussen, Kevin's father, in 1997, came from a lower category, had factory support from Ford, and none other than Sir Jackie Stewart running things, still struggled a lot in their first year, even with good drivers, structure, and money. And in the mid-90s, we saw several cases of teams that underestimated this whole challenge, as I even mentioned in the video about forgotten cars in history. Some were even ready but never raced, like in '97, the Lola MasterCard, a story so trashy it makes me want to do a Teams We Love episode for a team that only did the free practice and qualifying in Australia in just 1 race, and didn't even show up here for the second round at Interlagos. I've kind of already told part of this story in this video here. Nowadays, Formula One is organized differently. To get a spot, first the FIA needs to open a selection process, and once you meet the pretty strict requirements for infrastructure and prove you have the financial backing for the challenge, you then move on to the commercial stage of convincing Formula One to open up an extra spot. Today, everything is contractual, tied up in a franchise system, just like the American sports leagues such as the NFL, NHL for hockey, the NBA, and Major League Baseball. Do we miss teams like Spiker, Super Aguri, Minardi, and others? Yes, we do. But the technical level was very low. That's just not in line with today. Oh, but this professionalism is such a drag. True, but everything is more professional now. In your company, in my company, in your job, in our work. This is how the world is. It's not Formula One's fault. Watching Formula One races in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was a very different task from today, and much closer to watching at a racetrack, because seeing a race at a racetrack isn't simple for beginners. You need to pay a lot of attention to understand what's going on, so you don't get lost when the cars mix together. And on TV, in the past, you spent a good part of the time just trying to figure out what was going on. Unlike today, when the amount of information available to you in real time, always on the screen, makes the experience much more immersive, much more intense. And I'm not even talking about the countless ways you can watch the race now, with multiple screens, onboard cameras with your favorite driver, listening to all the radio communications, and so on. Until 1988, there weren't even onboard cameras. Oh, DM, but I've seen it before. Yes, sometimes they would put cameras on during a practice session and the car would do a lap and they'd record the footage, but that wasn't happening in a competitive situation, on a flying lap in qualifying or during the race. Timing was done manually, and to know what was happening, usually the TV stations had someone up in the tower following along and speaking into a microphone to the commentator's earpiece, or directly into the broadcast, explaining what was going on. There were no on-screen graphics telling you fastest lap, standings, sector times, microsectors, real-time gaps, and so on. Radio communications, for that matter, only started showing up in the 2000s. But what about that lap with Senna explaining Interlagos and all that? Again, that was during a free practice session in 1994. It was recorded and then added to the broadcast. By the way, with the delay, besides not knowing lap times and so on, even the running order was a mystery, and the commentator would spend a third of the time telling you, so-and-so is first, so-and-so is second, so-and-so is third, lap after lap. When the guys made a pit stop, it was normal to have to wait for everyone to cross the finish line before you could see the new gap between them, because this timing system we have nowadays, the little circuit map and all that, showing exactly what's happening at that moment, was a distant dream back then, almost like science fiction if you think about it, just like today making a video call with my niece on my cell phone. She was watching me from her city, while I was here at my house in Sao Paulo. The broadcast had about 3 or 4 cameras. One, of course, was showing the start and finish straight, and the others were spread out at strategic points. And the seam cuts weren't made to follow the car as it moved ahead, because there were blind spots, so the cut would go back to the straight to wait for the guy to show up. More complex tracks like the Nürburgring, which is huge, with 21 kilometers winding through the forest in Germany, could only be followed by helicopter, resulting in a chaotic and incomplete image. As Reginaldo Lamy told us in an interview, the Germans set up a panel with lights that would turn on to give you an idea of where the cars were on the track, among the more than 200 corners of the Nordschleife. There was no information about the gear, no information about the RPM, and if you were lucky, they would let you know when there were characters on screen which lap of the race we were on. Starting in 1988, onboard cameras began to appear, usually on just one car. Replays were extremely limited, and the lack of awareness affected both us and those broadcasting the race. I remember it like it was yesterday. Pit stop, Ayrton Senna and Michael Schumacher at Interlagos in '94. Senna stops in front of Schumacher. Schumacher leaves first. It's worth watching the video about the cheating for a very good theory that explains why he had a faster pit stop, and then both of them come out ahead of the other Benetton, Jos Verstappen, who was coming up. As a result, Galvaro, during the broadcast, assumes that Senna had somehow regained the lead. But actually, Schumacher was ahead, Senna was second, and Jos was a backmarker, behind the Brazilian.
Mike comes out ahead. Both came into the Bennett team did a job because the first position there is Senna. He's already back in front. Do you even find a way to like that? The truth is, Senna managed to regain the position.
Oh, but are you criticizing, talking bad about the guy? Without enough information, he was just doing his job. No, not at all. I'm just telling you that this kind of thing happened, and if they got confused, imagine us watching from home. Nowadays, there are about 25 to 30 cameras positioned around the circuits. Onboard cameras in every car, more than one, sensors reporting which gear, RPM, and the G-force involved with every movement of the car down to each millisecond, plus lap time tracking, not just in 3 sectors of the lap, which was already a luxury back in the early 90s, but also in microsegments that you can select to see if your driver, right after leaving the pits, is already going faster. The difference is staggering. In a single lap of today's broadcast, even on free-to-air TV, you don't even need the paid F1 TV. You get more information than in an entire Formula One season in the 90s. You better believe it. Information leads to understanding. Understanding brings appreciation and depth, which allows you, me, all of us, to grasp and see Formula One on a much deeper level. Thanks to light, to information. So a big part of that mysterious and romantic, distant component of Formula One in the past also comes down to ignorance, to lack of information. A lot of people will sit down and tell you that the races from back in the day were the creme de la creme, absolute cinema, as Scorsese would say, and you might end up thinking that those were insane battles, from the first to the last lap, an all-out brawl on 4 wheels at over 300 kilometers per hour, right? So, just by carefully analyzing the detailed timing data, diligently watching the races themselves, which I regrettably cannot show here for copyright reasons, and even simply remembering, if you personally watched them, and from 1988 onwards I conscientiously watched all of them, or at the very least almost all, you will honestly and truly come to the undeniable conclusion: a significant number of those particular races were, in fact, quite a bore. But wait, ADM, what about Donington Park 93, Dijon 1979, the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard 1990, and so on? Well, let's start with this. People usually prefer races where Brazilians won. Not necessarily Brazilians, if they're from another nationality, but here we're talking to our own audience. So, taking out the home country factor and looking closely at the races themselves, I always mention a classic example of a race that was good but massively one-sided: the 1987 British Grand Prix. Mansell and Piquet were racing for Williams Honda. Who else was left? Ayrton Senna in the Yellow Lotus. Nelson Piquet started in first, Nigel Mansell in second, Alain Prost in the McLaren in third, and Senna in the Yellow Lotus in fourth. Senna finished the first lap in third, leaving Prost in fourth. The Frenchman fought back and took the position back from the Brazilian. Up front, Piquet and Mansell pulled away. The race went on more or less like that, and the plan at Williams was for no one to make a pit stop. Mansell was tailing Nelson about 2 seconds behind, and things would have stayed that way if he hadn't decided to change up the strategy. He came into the pits, put on new tires, and started climbing back up. But he was so far behind Senna, who was in third, that Nelson, he didn't even lose second place. With 28 laps to go, he starts his charge and begins closing the gap in front of 200,000 English fans watching the scene. He catches up, reaches Piquet just a few laps from the end, overtakes him, and the two cross the finish line separated by 1.9 seconds. The third place finisher, Ayrton Senna, ends up a lap behind. Fourth was Satoru Nakajima, fifth Derek Warwick, and sixth Theo Fobby, all of them in the points zone, since only the top 6 scored, and all of them were 2 laps down, 1 lap behind Senna, who was third. Then Bout Sen finished 7th, 3 laps down, Jonathan Palmer was 8th, 5 laps down, and Pascal Fabre was 6 laps behind. No one else finished the race. Philip Strauff had engine trouble. Martin Brundle finished 11 laps down because he spent a long time stopped in the pits. Alain Prost retired with engine problems, Michel Alboreto with suspension issues, Eddie Cheever with engine failure, Adrian Campos with fuel injection trouble, Alex Caffey with engine problems, Christian Danner with gearbox failure, and so on with several others. Out of the 26 who started, 8 crossed the finish line. And this is a race remembered as a good one, so much so that I'm here talking about it to you. But there were many other boring races during that period, and we actually remember the ones that had some excitement because they were the exception. Donington 1993, Dijon 79, and several others, including some with a Brazilian victory, where the guy started on pole and just ran away with it. Did we have great races? We did. And I come back to the topic, and we can remember them. For example, Suzuka 1988, Senna stalls, drops to 14th, climbs back up the field, overtakes Prost, and wins the title. But here's the thing, if we can remember them, it's because they were special. I don't remember what happened at the 1989 United States Grand Prix. You don't remember the 2007 Hungarian Grand Prix. You might even remember what happened in qualifying, when Alonso held up Hamilton so he couldn't do his lap in Q3, right? Exactly, but you don't remember the race. I don't remember. And that's perfectly fine. The truth is, Formula One today is more balanced, more unpredictable. The driver's level is higher, the teams are more evenly matched, the reach is much greater, and the broadcasts are way more complete and informative. Back in the day, you had low-level drivers, cars that broke down all the time, and teams with absolutely massive differences between them. How can you compare Schumacher's 1995 Benetton Renault with Moreno and Dinize's 40 course, which would finish 6 or 7 laps behind? How can you compare Nelson Piquet's magnificent Brabham BMW Turbo from '83, which, on top of everything, was gorgeous with that arrow-shaped design, to the Ram of Kenny Hutchinson, who put the Englishman on the grid at Silverstone 8.6 seconds behind pole position, which was set that day by René Arnoux in a Renault? Do you get my point? It's perfectly fine to feel nostalgic about that era. It's fine to like it more, because taste isn't up for debate. Personally, I think the season with the most beautiful cars in Formula One history was 1991. Just look at that McLaren, look at that Williams, look at that Ferrari 643, the Minardi. Even the Brabham, on the verge of bankruptcy, was beautiful. Taste is taste. That's just how it is. Everyone has their own, but the problem is trying to give it some scientific or factual basis when there isn't any, because the drivers on the grid were of a lower level, the cars and teams were worse, the broadcasts were much less informative and knowledgeable, and the races were often boring. Let me recommend to you the website I used to get this information, Stats F1. Just go in there randomly, so it doesn't look like I'm setting things up and searching beforehand to get it right. I'm going to do a test. Hungary 1988. Shall we see? Hungary GP 1988. Wikipedia. It doesn't even have to be on Stats F1. Qualifying. Ayrton Senna on pole. 127.635. Last classified, from Eurobrune, Stefano Modena, 132.614. 4.9 seconds behind. That's the last one who qualified. Oscar Larori didn't qualify. What a throwback, right? Oscar Larori. You didn't even know who he was. Bernd Schneider, Julian Bailey, Piercarlo Ghinzani, 7 seconds slower. In the race, Senna wins with a time of 1 hour, 57 minutes and 47 seconds, 76 laps. The top 4 finish on the lead lap, with Gerhard Berger in 4th driving a Ferrari, almost getting lapped, 1 minute and 28 seconds behind. Then, in 5th and 6th, Mauricio Gugelmin and Riccardo Patrese, just 1 second apart. 8th and 9th, Satoru Nakajima and Nelson Piquet. Look at that, Nakajima ahead of Piquet, both Lotuses, 3 laps down. Yannick Dalmaz, an incredible driver with Le Mans victories, racing for Lola Ford, 4 laps down, and then up to 13th place finished, but with 3, 4, or even 5 laps behind. A sea of retirements. I invite you to try this out. You'll understand. All this just to say, appreciate today's Formula One. 20 years from now, we don't even know if it'll still exist. And remember, those who live in the past belong in a museum. The V10s aren't coming back, Ayrton Senna isn't coming back, and neither is Jack Rapagua. I've already made a video here discussing the question, did they win with the best car? That was also an exercise in going back to the past and showing that this talk about a golden age that never existed is just that, talk about a golden age that never existed. Drivers, cars and teams, broadcasting, races. We talked about all 4, so that was another episode of Splash and Go on YouTube. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Leave a like, it's free, costs nothing, and really helps the channel and our work to bring light to the darkness. And I want to ask you to comment down below. Did you go look it up on Stats F1? Did you come across this reality of drivers being 8 seconds slower? What's your earliest memory of Formula One? What's your favorite season? I really like 1991. Of course, also because a Brazilian won in the end. Did you know that between 1990 and 1991, There was a moment from the last two races of 1990 to the fifth round of 1991 when, for 7 races in a row, the Brazilian national anthem was played. Because Piquet won in Suzuka and Adelaide in 90, Senna took the first 4 Phoenix, Interlagos, San Marino, and Monaco, and Piquet also won the 5th round in Montreal, his last in Formula 1. So, 7 consecutive races with a Brazilian winning. Imagine how annoying that must have been to follow in another country. See how this whole thing is really relative. See how this was the golden era for a lot of Formula 1 fans here in Brazil. And that doesn't really hold up, because honestly, it was kind of boring. Anyway, the comment section is all yours. Don't want to comment anything? Just drop an emoji, send regards to your spouse, your partner, your cat, your dog, your parakeet, because the algorithm sees comments as engagement and keeps spreading us across the internet. Share this video in your WhatsApp groups, at work, in your building, wherever. Who knows, maybe you'll find someone who likes Formula 1 and help grow our community here. I'm counting on you all to help spread the word. To make sure you don't miss anything we do here, we have notification channels Instagram, Telegram, and WhatsApp where you automatically get an alert every time new content drops, Formula 1 weekend schedules, breaking news, and more. And last but not least, here are our social media handles Instagram, Twitter, Threads, and TikTok, where there's always fresh content. Deal? That's it. Then, thanks, and a big hug to you all.